Hi, welcome to Bible Time with Aunt Kat, where we talk about real people who God tells us of in His Word, the Bible. Real people who can teach us things that we need to know so that we can live a life that is pleasing to God. God cannot lie, so every word in the Bible is true. That means that all these things really happened. Have you ever had a job to do that seemed so big you thought you could never get it done? Maybe your room is an absolute mess and your mom wants it cleaned up before bedtime. You don't think there's any way on earth you can get that room cleaned up before bedtime all by yourself. But then your brother comes in and he says, if we work together, we can get this done. We can do it. Yes, we can. And he starts working with you right beside you. And you get your room cleaned well before bedtime. Today, we're going to meet a yes, we can kind of fella. His name is Nehemiah. Nehemiah had been taken captive from Jerusalem, and he was a cupbearer to the king of Persia. That was a very important job. He had heard that the wall of the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed, and he asked the king if he could go back and rebuild it. And the king agreed. When he got to Jerusalem, he told the people there how the king had agreed to let him come, how God had been with him all the way, and that they should rebuild the wall. They agreed and they got to work, working side by side. But there were three other men from other countries who were very angry that the Jews were rebuilding the wall. Their names were Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. They began to mock them. If a fox jumped on that wall, he would knock it over. But Nehemiah prayed, and the people kept building, and soon the wall was half done. Sanballat and the others were very angry that they were succeeding, and they threatened to slip in and kill them and stop the work on the wall. The people got very discouraged. But Nehemiah told them to remember God, who is great and awesome. We can do this. Fight for your families. He told the people who were building to hold a weapon in one hand and your working tool in another, and work with one hand and be ready to fight with the other hand. And that's just what they did. And Nehemiah worked right beside them too. And they had a trumpeter. He was standing watch. And if he saw those enemies coming, he was going to blow his trumpet, and all of them were going to gather around at that spot and fight. So they worked and worked. They worked day and night. They didn't change their clothes. They just kept a-working with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. And they got that job done in 52 days. That's not even 2 months. That was really fast. Even their enemies realized that this could not be done without the help of God. So Nehemiah was an encourager. He was a yes, we can kind of guy. He was a wise man because he knew that without God's help, they couldn't do anything. And he knew to rely on God for everything. So we're going to do a little bit of a demonstration to show just how important it is to make sure that our foundation is always upon God and It's not upon what men say and men think. Do you remember when you were little singing about the wise man building his house upon the rock? Well, we've got the wise man's house upon the rock right here, and the foolish man's house upon the rock, upon the sand right here. And we're going to see just what happens to their houses. Do you want to sing it while we do this? The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rain came tumbling down. The rain came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up, and the house on the rock stood firm. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rains came tumbling down. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up, and the foolish man's house went smash. There it goes. He didn't build on a good foundation, did he? Nehemiah built upon prayer and trust in God's word. Even when other people were making fun of them and telling them it was impossible, there was no way they could build that wall, he trusted God. He trusted in the impossible. So, because God said they could do it. And that's what we have to do. We have to trust in God, and He's our foundation, right? So let's go back over to the Bible and see what our memory verse is. So, even though they had hard work to do, and people mocking them and enemies threatening them, Nehemiah and the people trusted God to help them get the job done. And he reminded the people that with God's help, yes, we can. So our memory verse is, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. 1 Corinthians 2:5. So in other words, our faith is not built on what men say. Our faith is built upon the power of God and what God has to say. And we're going to sing it to the tune of The Wise Man. And let me get a sip again. So that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. 1 Corinthians 2:5. So that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. 1 Corinthians 2:5. I don't know if that's the wise men or not. So that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. 1 Corinthians 2:5. There you go. One more time. So that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. 1 Corinthians 2:5. Okay, next week we're going to be talking about a man who understood that Jesus has all power in the lesson of the centurion servant. And don't forget to spread the word about our channel. See you next week on Bible Time with Aunt Kat.